In 1958, Cary Grant walked into a psychiatrist's office in Los Angeles and did something almost no Hollywood star had ever done voluntarily. He asked to be taken apart. He was 54 years old, one of the most famous men alive, and, by every external measure, the films, the money, the voice, the career that seemed to operate on its own separate logic from the rest of human endeavor, he had succeeded at a scale most people cannot imagine. He returned to that office, or one very much like it, roughly 100 times over the next several years. He lay on a couch and talked. He wept. He laughed at things that weren't funny until they suddenly were. He went back the following week and started again. And here is what separates his story from the standard celebrity biography. He told the press about it while the sessions were still ongoing. Not in a memoir softened by age and distance. Not in a deathbed interview designed to settle scores. He sat down with journalists in the middle of the process and said, "Essentially, I am trying to find out who I actually am, and I have not managed it yet." What did the man-born Archibald Alexander Leach believe he was looking for inside those 100 sessions that fame, 4 marriages, and 72 films had failed to locate for him? His real name was Archibald Alexander Leach. He was born January 18, 1904, in Bristol, England, in a terraced house in Horfield, a working-class district far enough from glamour that the word itself would have seemed like a foreign language. The street looked like every other street nearby. The house looked like every other house on it. His father, Elias James Leach, worked at a clothing factory, pressing other people's suits, a man whose daily occupation involved making surfaces look immaculate, smoothing out wrinkles, presenting garments as better than they were. His mother, Elsie Maria Kingdon, before she married, was lively and pretty and prone to silences that could descend without warning and last for days. The household was not unusual for its time and place. It was the kind of home that gave no outward sign of what was about to happen inside it. When Archie was 9 years old, his mother disappeared. Elsie Leach was 33 when she was committed to Glenside Hospital, a psychiatric institution on the edge of Bristol. The story given to Archie was vague and inconsistent. She had gone away for a rest, she was at the seaside, she was unwell and needed quiet. She would be back. She was not back. His father did not explain further, and Archie did not press because children in that house in that era did not press. The wardrobe was gradually emptied of her clothes. The photographs were removed from the surfaces where they had sat. Her name stopped being used in ordinary conversation, and Archie Leach, 9 years old, in Horfield, Bristol, learned what would become the central lesson of his formation. The people you depend on most completely can simply cease to be present, without warning and without explanation, and the only available response is to carry on as if nothing particular has occurred. He absorbed this lesson so thoroughly that he spent the next 4.5 decades enacting it. He was not yet 14 when he found the Bob Pender Troupe, a company of acrobats and comic performers working the variety circuit around England. He lied about his age to be considered. Within weeks, he was learning how to fall without injuring himself, how to time a joke to the precise second, how to read an audience the way an experienced sailor reads the sky. Physical comedy is more disciplined than it looks from the outside. It requires exact self-knowledge, complete trust in the people working beside you, and the ability to project relaxed confidence in exactly those moments when you are most uncertain about the outcome. Archie Leach turned out to be naturally gifted at all three, which perhaps says something about the kind of training his childhood had provided without meaning to. In 1920, the Pender Troupe sailed to New York for an engagement. Archie was 16. He looked at the city, absorbed it for a moment, and decided not to go home. The decade that followed was the decade of becoming someone else. He worked the New York vaudeville circuit and then moved into musical theater, where the work was steadier and the ambitions larger. He was tall, dark-haired, physically capable of almost anything the stage required. and in possession of a voice that settled in the ear the way certain pieces of music do, like something remembered rather than heard for the first time. He also had a quality that people in rooms noticed before they could describe it, a quality of being watched without appearing to perform for the watching. Producers and directors encountered it and found it difficult to articulate. The camera, it turned out, had no such difficulty. It simply found him and kept finding him every time. By 1931, he was in Hollywood. By 1932, he had a Paramount contract and a new name, Cary Grant. The studio's people chose it. He accepted without apparent resistance. The transaction was clean and final. Archibald Leach, the boy from Bristol whose mother had been removed without explanation and whose father had not explained, was placed to one side. Cary Grant, elegant, unruffled, capable of being precisely as funny or as dangerous as the scene required, stepped into the available space and occupied it completely. What followed across the next 3 decades is one of the most sustained and genuinely distinguished careers in the history of American cinema. He made 4 pictures with Alfred Hitchcock, and each of them used his specific quality, the charm that sits directly over anxiety, the grace that barely conceals something more volatile, as its organizing principle. Hitchcock understood what Grant was, possibly better than Grant understood it himself at that point, and built films around the gap between the man everyone saw and the man beneath the performance. He made screwball comedies that required him to be simultaneously absurd and irresistible, a combination that is considerably harder to maintain than audiences register while watching. He worked with Howard Hawks on his Girl Friday and Bringing Up Baby. He worked with George Cukor and Leo McCarey and Stanley Donen. He earned Academy Award nominations for Penny Serenade in 1941 and None But the Lonely Heart in 1944, and won neither, a fact that says rather more about the Academy's relationship with comic performance than it says about the quality of the work. In 1970, the Academy gave him an honorary Oscar, the kind of award that functions partly as apology. Off-screen, the picture was considerably less composed. He married 5 times. His first wife was Virginia Cherrill, the actress who played the blind flower girl in Chaplin's City Lights. They married in 1934 and divorced the following year. The marriage lasted barely long enough to photograph. His second wife was Barbara Hutton, the Woolworth heiress, at that point one of the wealthiest women in the world. The tabloid press immediately produced the nickname Cash and Cary, which was the sort of joke that reveals nothing about the people it targets and everything about the laziness of whoever coined it. They divorced in 1945. His third marriage, to the actress Betsy Drake, was quieter and longer, 12 years, ending in 1962. And Drake was by most accounts the person in his life most responsible for directing him towards psychotherapy in the first place. His fourth marriage, to the actress Diane Cannon, produced the one thing he had wanted and missed throughout his adult life: a child. His daughter Jennifer was born in 1966. The marriage ended in divorce in 1968, and the proceedings were not quiet. His fifth and final marriage, to Barbara Harris, a woman 33 years younger than he was, began in 1981 and continued until his death 5 years later. Those who knew them describe it as the most settled and genuinely contented period of his personal life. Across those 5 marriages, across the decades of fame and financial security and professional admiration, something persisted that none of the external circumstances could touch. He was, by nearly every account from people who knew him well, a man who wanted closeness and could not quite maintain it, who wanted to be seen and could not quite permit it, who had constructed, at enormous cost over a very long time, a version of himself so polished and so complete that there appeared to be no opening through which a more truthful person might emerge. He was Cary Grant. He said himself, in the most quoted line of his life, that everyone wanted to be Cary Grant, and that this included him, which is what took him, in 1958 into Mortimer Hartman's office. Hartman was a Los Angeles psychiatrist who worked with a relatively small number of patients using intensive therapeutic methods. Grant committed to the process in the way he committed to serious work, completely and with careful attention to what was actually happening rather than what he had assumed would happen. He returned for sessions across a period of several years. He kept notes on what arose. He discussed what he found with people he trusted. He did not treat it as a curiosity or an experiment. He treated it as the most important project of his adult life, which, given what he was looking for, it was. What surfaced repeatedly and insistently was his mother. He had not seen Archie Leech for approximately 20 years when he learned in 1935 that she was alive. He had believed, or had organized himself around believing, that she was dead. She was not dead. She had been resident at Glenside Hospital for 2 decades. His father had known this throughout and had not told him. Grant was 31 years old when this information reached him. He was already, by that point, established in Hollywood, already carrying the name Cary Grant and the career that went with it. The entire construction of who he was had been built, consciously and unconsciously, on the understanding that the worst thing had already happened, that his mother had gone and was not coming back, and that a person could absorb such a loss and continue functioning. To discover that the loss itself had been a fabrication, that his mother had been alive and institutionalized, and 50 miles from where he grew up while he was being told some vague story about the seaside, required a revision of the ground his identity stood on. He responded in the most practical way available to him. He brought Elsie to California. He purchased a house for her. He visited. He paid for her care. He attempted, in the careful and slightly formal manner of a man who has been without a mother for over 2 decades and has not retained clear instructions for how to have one, to build a relationship with her. By surviving accounts from people who observed them together, they were courteous with each other, occasionally warm and never quite at ease. They were 2 people who had each spent so long organizing themselves around the other's absence that the other's presence was a category they hadn't entirely prepared for. Archie Leech lived until 1973. Her son was present at her death. None of this, not her return, not his care for her, not the practical resolution of the situation, resolved anything internally. Grant said this himself, in terms that were direct enough to make interviewers uncomfortable. He said he had spent the majority of his life performing Cary Grant rather than being anyone in particular, that the ease and the charm and the physical grace that audiences responded to were real as technique and real as discipline, but were also, at a level beneath the technique, a way of not being present in the way that would have left him exposed to something he didn't have a name for until the therapy sessions began to name it. He had learned, at 9, to be competent and presentable in the immediate aftermath of devastation. He had gone on learning this, refining it, adding to it, until the competence and the presentability were so thorough that the devastation beneath them was no longer visible even to him most of the time. The sessions made it visible. That was their function, and they performed it. The changes that followed were not dramatic in the way that changes in films are dramatic. There was no single moment of breakthrough that everything before and after can be organized around. What there was, across several years of returning to that office, was a gradual and observable shift in how Grant moved through the world. He spoke about his childhood in interviews rather than deflecting. He talked about his mother's disappearance and what it had cost him. He said openly that the persona people loved was a persona, that Archibald Leach was still in there, still somewhat bewildered, still trying to work out what had been real. People who knew him in the 1960s and later described someone who seemed not exactly more vulnerable, but less continuously on guard. The performance was still there. It had been his life's work, and it didn't simply dissolve, but the anxiety of maintaining it at every moment had loosened somewhat. He retired from acting in 1966. He was 62, and he had made 72 films. The industry was surprised. He was still, by the assessment of almost anyone qualified to assess such things, operating at the top of his capability. He said the decision was primarily about Jennifer. He wanted to be present for his daughter in the daily, unglamorous way that a working actor cannot be. This was true, and probably sufficient. But knowing what the preceding years had clarified for him, it seems reasonable to read in the retirement also a recognition that the performance, for all its brilliance and all its achievement, had served its original purpose and did not need to continue indefinitely. The 2 decades that followed were, by most accounts, the most quietly satisfying of his life. He traveled. He sat on corporate boards. He attended events and was gracious at them without the old vigilance behind the graciousness. People who encountered him in this period consistently describe a man who was funny without working at it, warm without monitoring the warmth, and genuinely interested in the people he was talking to rather than managing their impression of him. His marriage to Barbara Harris, which began in 1981, appeared to give him something that the previous 4 had not quite provided: a partnership in which he was not required to be Cary Grant as a condition of being present. He died on November 29, 1986, in Davenport, Iowa. He had traveled there to participate in a one-man evening called A Conversation with Cary Grant, an event in which he would appear on stage and speak, without a script, about his life and career. He suffered a stroke in his hotel room that afternoon before the performance took place. He was 82 years old. The 100 sessions did not produce a cure, and Grant never described them as if they had. What they produced was understanding, specific, hard-won, and late in arriving. He understood, by the end of those years, why the charm had always sat over something more cautious, why the marriages had pulled toward closeness and then pulled away from it, why the name change had been accepted so readily and the original name set aside so completely, why performing had been, for so long, more manageable than simply being. He had traced all of it back to a terraced house in Horfield and a 9-year-old who had decided, without being given any other option, that the correct response to the inexplicable removal of the person he needed most was to straighten up and continue. What remains remarkable is that he said so, publicly, in print, to journalists writing for general audiences, while the work was still in progress. In an era when the Hollywood star system depended on the preservation of mystery, when a career was understood as a thing that could be damaged by the revelation of too much ordinary human interior, Cary Grant sat across from reporters and described, with some precision, what he had found when he finally looked at himself carefully. He said that the person people admired had been assembled from the residue of a loss he had not been permitted to mourn. He said that he was still, at 54 and at 60, in the process of finding out what was underneath. He did not perform the revelation, he reported it. Whether he got all the way to the bottom of it is not answerable from the outside, and probably wasn't from the inside either. What is answerable is that he spent 30 years, from the mid-1930s, when he learned his mother was alive, to the mid-1960s, when he stopped making films, doing the work of understanding what had actually happened to him, and then trying to live differently in light of it. 72 films, 5 marriages, 1 daughter he loved without reservation, and roughly 100 sessions on a couch in Los Angeles looking for Archibald Leach in the place where Cary Grant had been standing for so long. He found some of him, perhaps enough.